If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging. What is the deal with old man strength, and why do I find it somewhat offensive? In this episode, Corbin and I discuss what it is, why do some men possess it, and why is it important for aging well.
Hey, I know we've asked ChatGPT about specific topics before, but have you ever considered asking it about specific terminologies? I'm talking about terminologies such as old man strength, and I think that if we do that, we could get a pretty cool response.
What does ChatGPT say about old man strength?
Okay, here we go. Old man strength is a colloquial term used to describe the seemingly disproportionate physical strength and resilience that some older individuals exhibit. The concept suggests that as men age, they develop a certain level of strength that goes beyond what would be expected based solely on their muscle mass or apparent physical condition. The idea behind old man strength is often anecdotal and lacks scientific backing. Some attribute this perceived strength to a lifetime of physical activity, experience, and muscle memory that older individuals may have developed over the years. Others believe it may be related to a combination of factors, including improved technique, mental toughness, and a deeper understanding on how to use one's body efficiently. Oh man, I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. I have a feeling you may like it, and I know I don't need to ask it, but I will. Do you exhibit old man strength?
I think this is a great topic. Do I exhibit old man strength? Well, let's discuss this. For my age, yes, I have pretty good strength. Some might call it old man strength, but I just call it strength.
You don't like the term old man strength?
I do not. And by the way, why don't we ever hear of old woman strength?
Well, that sounds offensive. Is that why you don't like the term old man strength? Do you find it offensive?
I find it more ageist than offensive. Why can't men, and women for that matter, be strong across the lifespan? At what point is one supposed to succumb to this ageist belief that with age comes sarcopenia and frailty?
ChatGPT also stated that it's important to note that individual experience vary, and not every older person will exhibit this type of strength. Additionally, there isn't a clear scientific basis for the concept, as strength is influenced by various factors, including genetics, lifestyle, and overall health. Let's dive a bit deeper into the concept of old man strength.
Okay, but let's stop calling it old man strength. Let's consider it for what it is. Strength for aging well.
Strength for aging well. How does your strength compare to the norm? And what should be the norm?
Good question. How does my strength compare to the norm? I think it's well above the norm when we talk about people 60 years of age. Look at the normative data, what percentile you fall into a strength. In most of them, I'm going to fall, sadly, into, in many cases, like the 99th percentile for strength, which is absurd. We did some muscle testing in my exercise testing and prescription class these recent weeks. And just for fun, I did like the YMCA bench press test, which all the students have to do. And it's for any individual. For males, it's going to be benching as many repetitions as you can at a set cadence with 80 pounds. And they lost count how many reps I was doing. I think I did at least 45 reps, and I think most of them were doing like 25 reps. And that was like well above the norm for a 60-year-old. for squat. I forget the exact numbers, and you see different norms for squat, but in many cases, it's about being able to squat your body weight. And I can easily do that. I just, this past week, hit a PR for the Zercher squat for my working sets. So that's the maximum amount of weight that I do for repetitions. And I did 345 for 5 reps and could have done a couple more reps. So that's like 1.5 times my body weight. Bench press, I'm about at body weight, but a little bit higher for a 1 repetition maximum, but I don't do that. And I think that's something we could kind of talk about in terms of what should people be doing. When we talk about norms, I think there's an issue with norms because everybody's different. And those normative data are data that are spread across the wider population. And you can't always compare yourself honestly to the norms. But I would say, yeah, overall, I am above the norm when it comes to strength for a 60-year-old, which is, in my opinion, sad.
I wouldn't. I think you're pretty strong, especially not just in your age bracket, but just in an overall age bracket. I would say you're above normal for a lot of individuals.
But again, what defines normal? Normal is what people are normally doing. Is it what people should be doing?
Well, yeah, but like ChatGPT was saying with the factors, there can be genetics, but there's primarily lifestyle as well. You know, if you look at people from our grandparents' age, a lot of them grew up on a farm or had a trade job that they worked with their hands, whether they were a mechanic or a carpenter or something to that effect. And if you look at that demographic of individuals, I remember when I was doing personal training, and I don't know what it was, but 74-year-olds, they had an abnormal amount of strength compared to the 20-year-olds that I was training, which you think like, oh, the 20-year-olds or the 18 or 19-year-olds who have a spike in their hormone levels and they're optimized in that youthful age, they should be able to have this great level of strength. But it was the 74-year-olds that had far more endurance, strength, and just overall fitness.
So you're supporting this idea of old man strength.
I do think that there is something there, and I think that there's currently something there. I think as the years go by, I think we as a society and a culture have become more sedentary. And I kind of believe that old man strength, that terminology, is going to deplete because I feel like we kind of have more sedentary jobs. You don't have individuals that are waking up, growing, working on a farm, doing farm work. We're seeing less and less of those trade jobs, the mechanics, the carpenters, the people that were, even construction workers. I feel like that plays a huge factor and a huge role into that overall strength as an individual ages.
Okay, with that in mind, I'm a college professor, very sedentary job, and I'm probably relatively stronger at 60 than I was at 50 or 40.
Correct. But you also have a background where you were a wrestler. You were a wrestler in high school, and then you were also a wrestler on a collegiate level as well. And so
I didn't wrestle in college.
Oh, you didn't wrestle in college?
Then I was not that. I wasn't good enough. I was barely good enough to wrestle in high school.
But regardless, you maintain some of that workout routine where a lot of people, they may play a sport in high school, but eventually they go to college and they stop their workout routine or they stop their physical fitness. And we've also discussed in prior episodes on the podcast, the earlier you get your children involved in sports such as gymnastics or, some form of resistance training, that carries forward into their later years.
And so why should we see a decline then in strength as we age?
Well, I don't know. And maybe this is just my point of view or my perspective, but I feel like with sports now, especially at a younger age, it's not necessarily as competitive as it once was. There's no denying that in the 90s, there was a big movement of participation trophies. And then you go on to any social media outlet, YouTube, or even the local news, and you see parents that are just super, super upset with coaches to that effect. And I feel like we're kind of transitioning into a realm where we weren't as physically active. We weren't as physically aggressive. We're a little bit more, dare I say, softer. And I feel like that without that competitive spirit, without pushing the body to be the best at starting from a younger age, I feel that also will carry into the older. That's just something that I've noticed, and I could be wrong. And to be honest, I hope that I'm wrong.
So that really kind of points to the concept that there's more of this old man strength than just the fact that old men are strong. We have unusually strong old men. There's other factors kind of contributing to that.
Correct. And I think that's because a lot of when I was personal training, some of the strongest individuals fell into that 74-year-old category. And it wasn't necessarily men. It was actually women. They just had a surprisingly high endurance level and strength level, again, comparatively to the individuals that were either just graduating high school or in their college age, where statistically speaking, those individuals should have had more endurance, more strength, but it wasn't the case. It was the 74-year-olds.
I hear a little bit of ageism in that, because it's that expectation that the older individuals shouldn't be as strong as they are, and it's surprising that they're strong.
Well, if you look comparatively, if you think of like a 74-year-old, you just picture a 74-year-old and you picture an individual in their 20s where you just read the scientific literature, and in your 20s, you have more muscle mass. Your hormones are supposed to be way better right around that age bracket. You think with the hormone balance and the muscle mass, just on a biological level, you're thinking, well, that person should have more strength and more endurance. And it's not necessarily ages to say, it's just, we also know that the literature also states as the older you go, or as the older you get and the more you age, there is supposed to be a decrease in strength and overall muscle mass, as well as a decrease in certain hormones such as testosterone and stuff like that, which we know can build strength. So I don't think it's necessarily ages per se. I think it's just you're taught something in school, and so that is your perception of what you're thinking. You're thinking that this individual who has on a biological level more strength and more endurance, biologically speaking, what we're taught. And then this individual who we're taught that the older they get, their muscle mass is slowly decreasing over the years. Well, I don't know. From personal experience, I don't think that's the case.
I think that's pretty much the definition of ageism. Our perceptions of what people should be as they age are taught to us, and they may not be the reality. And I think, when we look at strength should be increasing progressively as we age, because it's a cumulative effect. And to necessarily expect that we're going to be our strongest in our 20s, and that it's unusual that we get into our 40s, 50s, and 60s to be stronger than somebody in their 20s, just doesn't seem quite right to me. We should expect that. And so it shouldn't be surprising that, especially when we look at, and a lot of this talk of old man strength, they end up talking about people in their 50s. It's like, come on, those aren't even old men from my perspective. Right. But, we should expect to a certain extent that older males, at least, prior to 60 or so, are going to be on the stronger side relative to, say, their teenage children, and the majority of 20-somethings. and that those 20 somethings are going to get stronger progressively as they age, kind of working toward that bit of a genetic ceiling, and maybe not perfectly in that genetic ceiling, because not everybody's going to train optimally and to their greatest capacity to kind of optimize their strength, but there should be a general progression of strength. And I think the more we consider strength as a healthy component, as opposed to simply just a performance component, there's a greater capacity to continue to progressively increase that strength, because we're not rapidly increasing it early on, as say a power lifter would or a bodybuilder might, as they are training intensely in their youth and putting a lot of extra stress and load on the body to where the body's become beat down. And then that may lead to a certain amount of decline as they age. But if we are active, what defines that decline that we should be expecting as we age? I mean, the literature, in my perspective, is a little bit biased when it looks at that, because it looks at the norms. It looks like what is normally happening to a population that is increasingly sedentary. And so, of course, as we age, we're going to see much more dramatic declines, but that decline is the result of inactivity. Mm. And so when we start looking at old man strength, it shouldn't be the exception. It should be the norm when it comes to aging well.
Well, and I think I like the metaphor that we use on our podcast of, putting into that physical activity bank. The more we...
Yeah, that's your favorite.
I love it. I love that
you created it.
Was it me? I thought it was you.
No, I don't do that banking stuff.
Oh, man. Yeah, no, I think the younger it's kind of like, when you start a job, you want to be a little bit more aggressive when you're younger. And then as you get older, you want to be a little bit more reserved, but you have that cushion. You're more financially stable. I feel like it's the same in the physical realm. When you're younger, be as active as possible. Experience stuff, do as much resistance training as possible. And then the older you get, well, you've built up this metaphorical physical bank. You've built that muscle mass up. And I think it carries forwards into the older years as we age, and it can help us age well.
I think there can be a bit of a danger in that approach to strength as we are attempting to age well. If we are overly aggressive early on, there's greater likelihood of injury and damage that's going to prohibit us from being able to continue to progress as we age. You going to your kind of banking analogy, you invest aggressively early on, you have huge risk of losing it all. And then you have to kind of start from scratch again. But if we are conservatively aggressive in how we approach, whether it's our finances or our strength, cardiorespiratory performance, and so on, then we can build on that progressively without the big upsets, build on it progressively and continue to build on it. And if we take an attitude of, okay, I've hit a certain point now, as I am approaching retirement, I have to be far more conservative or I'm going to lose it all, then we don't see quite the same gains, if that makes any sense. I think there needs to be that balance in our approach to our physical performance in order to progressively continue to increase and adapt as we attempt to age well. So I think part of aging well from the standpoint of strength and maybe gaining old man strength, as we keep calling it, sadly, is to be a bit more conservatively aggressive in terms of how we approach strength training, resistance training, and our efforts to continue to grow stronger. And not suddenly hit a switch as we hit a certain age that, okay, now we have to suddenly start doing the ACSM guidelines and only, 8 to 10 repetitions or 8 to 12 repetitions of 8 to 10 exercises and 1 to 2 sets and, don't go full range of motion and all those types of things in order to preserve our bodies. And suddenly we start training like an old person instead of training wisely throughout the aging process so that when we get to those older ages, we're kicking the asses of all the younger people.
Well said. Now, I know you love Men's Journal.
Oh, you know I do.
Yeah, I can hear that sarcasm in your voice.
Is it that obvious?
It is. Anyhow, I came across this article titled, What's the Deal with Old Man Strength? The article claims that it can be something one can look forward to.
I would say it is something one should look forward to if they are attempting to age well. It should be more the norm than the exception, as we've been talking about. What else does the article say? What are the reasons it gives for so-called old man strength?
The author puts forward several potential causes. She refers to a hormonal last hurrah, muscle memory, and a change in priorities.
What does the scientific literature say about this hormonal last hurrah? Are there increases in hormonal activity as we approach the, quote, autumn, unquote, of our lives?
The author cites claims that there is a last surge for reproduction function before shutting down. This is said to come from an increase in testosterone, cortisol, insulin, and growth hormone that contribute to an increase in strength and recovery.
This seems like they may be talking about hormones in the 30s or 40s and maybe 50s. Let's look at the science.
There really doesn't seem to be any real solid evidence.
No, there doesn't. And it's not surprising. Changes in the endocrine system can be quite variable. We do see some decline in hormones, such as testosterone, beyond the age of about 40, but this would suggest a decrease in old man strength. The idea of a last hurrah makes some sense from an evolutionary point of view, last chance to procreate. But if it exists, it would be very short-lived and not explain, quote unquote, old man strength. Man, I hate that phrase.
So the article in Men's Health also talks about muscle memory. The author quotes Brandon Robert, a doctoral student of muscle biology at the University of Florida. As you age, neuromuscular control improves up to about age 55. At this point, the receptors required to activate muscles also start to decline.
I love how they never cite an actual research study.
Well, why would they do that?
Yeah, why would they do that?
But there is something to be said for continued motor development.
There is. But what does this mean for our beloved, quote, old man strength, unquote?
You must use the muscles.
Yes, use it or lose it. I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging.
So those old men who are unusually strong are strong because they've worked hard to get strong?
I would argue so.
All right. Well, then that kind of goes back to my old statement about...
Old statement?
Yeah, my old statement of what we said earlier. My old statement of what we said earlier of, those individuals that maintained a certain level of fitness over the years. They're strong because they've maintained that. They started when they were younger, and it's just kind of carried forward into their older years.
Exactly. I mean, we're trying to make this sound like something overly sciencey, when in reality, it's a matter of activity. When you look at people who are consistently working hard, lifting heavy weights on a regular basis, they're going to build up a level of strength. And with that comes a level of persistent strength. And sometimes that is much easier to hold on to than, say, strength that can be acquired at the gym. And, when they talk about muscle memory, to kind of go back to that a little bit, the idea of muscle memory is a little different than how they really present it in the article. Muscle memory, oftentimes people, say muscle memory, it's just like once you learn how to do a particular movement, it's always there. It's like you learn how to ride a bike, once you learn how to ride a bike, you can only ride a bike. That pertains a bit to some of the neuromuscular control. And we can look at neuromuscular control as something that progressively gets better because we're refining that motor control over the muscles. Makes sense. But there's also an element of what changes on a cellular level in the skeletal muscle. When you look at the myonuclei in the muscle, those are what control the muscle. Those are what communicate to tell the muscle and to hypertrophy, right? Mm. And so early on, the more we resistance train and the more we load the muscle, the more of those mononuclei we're able to produce within the muscle. And those tend to persist, at least according to some of the literature or current science, they tend to persist. And that enables us to build more muscle. But they also then persist into age. So even if we stop exercising for a period of time, they remain, which gives us a greater capacity to kind of rebuild some of that strength. So somebody who has been much more active and hardworking early on is going to have a little bit greater capacity when they are older to build some of that strength. Somebody who has been far less active and then decides, say in their 40s or 50s, that they want to start lifting weights are not going to see quite the same gains because that foundation isn't already provided. Does that make some sense?
Totally makes sense.
And so that just underscores the importance that if we want to age well, get on it early rather than waiting. And too many of us, those who would say, well, I don't have old man strength, those are people who they don't have old man strength because they didn't do the work in the earlier years. They didn't build up that old man strength. You're not going to suddenly start going to the gym in your 50s and see significant improvements in strength. You're not going to be blowing away everybody on the norms if you aren't persistent and lifting consistently over the course of your lifespan. And this includes men and women.
I feel though that, and maybe I'm wrong for thinking this. Obviously, resistance training, we definitely promote it here. Everyone should be lifting weights, but I personally feel like after kind of diving into this discussion, perhaps an individual should do more calisthenic style strength. That way, they're engaging way more muscle fibers than they would if they were just doing resistance training. So if they're doing their push-ups, their pull-ups, their dips, even involving muscles that say they're doing rock climbing or wrestling even, because when you're in those grapple positions, you're constricting everything. I feel like that would actually carry forward into our later years a lot more than just the standard weight resistance. Now, I'm not knocking weight resistance. I'm still advocating for that. But I just feel like, things where you're utilizing your body on a different, deeper level. I feel like that would carry forward more. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there's a little bit of disconnect in some of the terminology. I mean, calisthenics are, it's a pretty broad term. You mentioned resistance training. Resistance training really encompasses all of that. I mean, so when I talk about resistance training, I'm including anything that is putting load on the muscle. And again, it has to be an overload on the muscle. So the challenge I see with a lot of calisthenic-based exercise is at what point are you able to maintain that overload? Because if I'm doing push-ups with my body weight, unless my body weight is progressively increasing over time, the only way that I can increase the load on the body is doing more and more push-ups. Well, now it moves from strength to muscle endurance. And yes, muscle endurance is important, but so is strength. So how do we take those activities and progress those to build strength? And so there's that neuromotor piece that you can get from doing calisthenics. And I would agree that the more complicated the exercise is, the more carryover it's going to have to this idea of, I hate using this phrase, old man strength, but it's going to have a little bit greater carryover. That's why we see these people who have farmed or done construction or really heavy manual types of jobs exhibit what people are referring to as old man strength. But, to get true strength, I think we also have to include an element of really true strength training, which goes back to our basic 5 or basic 7, those movement patterns that we can load heavy. And again, heavy is always relative. It's a near maximal effort in order to build strength in those movements. And then that strength in those movements carries over to our capacity to do the other activities. And so there's a bit of a potentiation effect between the two types of activities. Again, more calisthenic or body movement, dynamic, heavily proprioceptive types of movements are going to carry over into your ability to do activities of strength in the weight room. The weight room is going to carry over into your ability to do more of those other activities.
But there's still ways to improve the intensity of a push-up. Like if you've mastered push-ups and you're like, okay, I can do 50 of them, you can also change hand movements. You can go into diamond push-ups as opposed to military style, as opposed to wide arm push-ups. You could elevate your feet onto a platform or even higher up onto a wall and perhaps even do handstand push-ups.
Yeah, but now you're changing the exercise too.
That's
so
true.
Again, you're not necessarily altering the load on the muscle in that particular movement pattern. You're altering a movement pattern, making it perhaps a bit more difficult. As you change that inclination, you're changing the angle of pull on the muscle, which kind of changes the movement. And if you move from a plank style position push-up to a handstand push-up, it suddenly moves from a horizontal push to a vertical push. And so I think it's important to vary those angles as we are progressing with the exercise. But how do we add additional load to the muscle so that we're not just simply adding repetitions to it? And that's where it becomes a bit more challenging. Some situations, it's not overly difficult to do some weighted banded push-ups or something like that. But we want to be able to progress that load as much as possible. And I would add that there is a lot of benefit to doing movements that are moving the body through space rather than the limbs moving toward the body. So rather than doing push-ups, rather than doing the bench press, you're doing push-ups. Rather than doing lat pull-downs, you're doing pull-ups. That tends to increase the activation of the muscles, pulls in many of the smaller support muscles, and that can have some added benefit. But again, doing that, you have to have a way of progressing the load in order to overload the system so that we can adapt.
Okay. Homeostasis.
Huh?
Homeostasis.
Well, we don't want homeostasis. I mean, homeostasis, how are you applying homeostasis?
Homeostasis is your body adapts under the situation that it's in. So if you started off doing push-ups and push-ups become, pretty easy, at some point you're going to maybe want to put a 45-pound plate on your back. And now those push-ups have become a little bit more challenging because we've increased the resistance and the weight. And then eventually your body's going to adapt to that and you can continue the process.
I'd call that homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis is just maintaining a stable environment within the body. So every system, every function within the body has a range of kind of homeostasis, how much hormone should be released or how much, what your heart rate should be, what your blood pressure should be, those types of things. That's all homeostasis, maintaining like body temperature of 98.6 degrees. What you're talking about is more of that status of adaptation, but that always, in order to be growing, we have to be pushing that. We talk our landmark volumes. you have your maintenance volume, and then you have a minimum effective volume. We have to be at least above that minimum effective volume or minimum effective training stimulus in order to see some adaptation in the system. If we're at that maintenance level, there's no change. We're just maintaining that throughout or whatever period of time. Eventually, I think if we maintain at a certain level for too long, the body suddenly can start to decline from that, I think. Not very scientifically stated there, but.
So, in conclusion, if you want to be old man strong, start early, be active, lift weights, do manual work. And if you do all these things, you can be labeled as old man strong and
age well.
Age well.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.